I misspoke, and I'll tell you how. I said these PowerPoints were up and available. They will be up and available. What I sent to Chandra turned out to bounce back to me because they were too big. So yesterday I shrank them all down and sent them through one at a time. And if you wish to go back to see some slide to try to win a bet with your friends or loved ones, or even reinforce your knowledge, they will be up. Just keep going back to the Osher site. So we come to the end, as it were, and the most important question in any history, if it's not to be that popular definition, that high school definition of history, one damn thing after another, is to say, so what? So what does all this mean? That you have all these different varieties of Christians contending for space, attention, for meaning. Well, first of all, it's their own interior meaning, their sense of purpose, and it's important that way. But I want to go back once again to Katrina and give some reflection. So we're here, Southern Christianities in harmony and conflict. If you haven't absorbed by now that sometimes we're all together and sometimes we're at each other's throats, then you probably haven't been paying attention. Or this is your first class. Either way, it's okay. Back even before I began to write this book, I spent many days on my daily commute, which involved coming up 65 and west briefly on I-40, and noticing how many church trailers and buses and other people's buses and trailers there were on their way down I-65 to go help out clean up Katrina. It was just really an armada of help. And that's, I think, how most Christians would most like to be seen. Or, the positive self-image. We're the people who will feed the hungry, like that Baptist guy I told you about who was just setting up tables and beginning to grill food right after the storm came and passed the morning of Katrina. You can go online, look up Southern Baptist Convention Men's Disaster Relief, and you will see page after page of images of men in yellow shirts. The Baptists are always in yellow shirts, the Methodists are always in red shirts, the Presbyterians are always in blue shirts. Don't ask me why, but it is the polo shirts or the t-shirts are the signifiers of this kind of helping corps. And these trucks aren't just rider or rental trucks of some kinds. These are trucks that these men's organizations own. And people give up their vacation and go or spend large parts of their retirements chasing storms at a safe distance to go help out. This is one in where West Virginia and Virginia was hit by floods. I could have used dozens more. That's how most Southern Christians would like to see themselves most of the time, as people responding in faith, trying to make the world better. A couple years before Katrina hit, I had another experience. I visited Riverbend Maximum Security Prison, It's the middle there. The entrance is right there with that single glass door into the insecure before secure entrance. Because I'd been advised that my school's innovative program of educating select prisoners and divinity students in the same Monday night class was at risk because the warden had issued a new ruling on religious groups. They're going to get rid of all the religious groups, or so the chaplain had told us. This isn't the chaplain, this is the man, Harmon Ray, who came to see me along with Richard Good, a professor from Lipscomb and a Vanderbilt graduate alum, who had read about a similar program that we, of educating divinity students and seminarians together at Sing Sing in New York. And he said, I wonder if we might do that. And what he was proposing was that Lipscomb, Belmont, the American Baptist College, and Vanderbilt might do this together. As it turned out, we were the only school that said yes, but it was one of those things when somebody says, do you want to go visit prisons? Do you want to be in some kind of serious ministry? What are you supposed to say, right? It's that Matthew 25 thing. Are you going to say no? Are you going to stand in front of Jesus at the end of all time and say, no, I didn't go. I didn't think it was a good idea. That was one I said, yeah, we'll go. And my associate dean said, what if the chancellor tells us we can't go? And then I say, well, then it's on him. But until they tell us we can't go, we're going. We're still going, by the way. But at this point, we go, and we're kind of going hand in hand. Please keep our program going. And after some preliminaries, I was pleased to learn that our program was not in trouble, nor was it a problem that our mutual students were studying theology. Warden Ricky Bell pulled out his Bible, hence the Holy Bible, King James Version, from his metal desk and told my academic dean and me about his own faith, and then turned to expressing his appreciation for what we were doing. These are men, he said. These are men who cannot leave, but these particular men have worked hard to come to terms with their lives and be better people right now, right here. An educational program like this gives them some way to continue to grow. And then he told us that his review of religious groups was put in place because so many of the groups simply came to preach conversion to the incarcerated men, telling them that they needed to turn their lives around, without ever stopping to ask what the men needed, or if they had turned their lives around, or establish relationships with them as individuals. It was all about what the churches wanted to do to or for the men as qua prisoners. From this I learned the unexpected humanity of a warden as a human being, and something more. Visiting a prisoner is an authentic Christian virtue. I was in prison and you visited me, says Jesus, in picturing the last judgment, separation of sheep from goats. But nowhere in Scripture does it say, you visited me and foisted your beliefs on me. So that gets us into sometimes the conflicts. I want to go back to this picture for any of you who weren't here last week. This was the celebration, funeral celebration for a young man whose mother was in the congregation of Cathedral Church of St. Luke in Orlando. He was killed in the Pulse nightclub shooting. It's a remarkable story of transformation because the bishop only a year before had turned away two gay men's child for baptism, and then felt horrible about it and reversed it, and a year later they rushed right in and full-heartedly did the funeral. This again is like how we would like to see ourselves as Christians, but it's not always that way. Matthew Vines is a commentator. He's early 30s now. He's gay, out, and Christian, and he wants to maintain all of those identities at once in his work. In Time magazine, he talked about so many of the things that were said right after the Pulse nightclub shooting. He said, here's an example of one of the things that sounds fairly innocuous, but you might want to think twice about. We feel the loss, hurt, and sorrow of those whose loved ones have been injured and killed in Orlando, Florida. We extend our sympathy and our prayers and ask God to comfort them in their sorrow, fill the void in their lives, and give them peace of God, the peace of God. We also lift our prayers for those who have been injured, believing that God will heal and restore them physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Now, that's the kind of thing that was said, and one of the more innocuous sorts of thoughts and prayers, kinds of things that was said by a religious leader. But not all LGBT Christians heard good news in some of those well-meaning messages. Matthew Vines wrote in Time magazine, and this went viral. He's the author of God and the Gay Christian, noted in his op-ed that nearly 50% of LGBT Americans are Christians, self-identifying Christians like himself. And he's a Southerner as well. For them, Sunday mornings are a reminder that they are not accepted in many pews, that many traditional churches view homosexuality as incompatible with Christian beliefs. And he wrote in that editorial, the core problem is that so many Christians still talk about the LGBT community like they're out there, like they're not part of the church, not part of the same family. That's the core problem. They use othering language, and you can find it even in this sort of thoughts and prayers. Those who were injured and their families. I could have come up with another one where it's, we hope that Christians will reach out to the gay community. So you got the binary of Christians and the gay community. Al Mohler from Louisville Seminary said something to that effect on the morning of the Sunday morning when it became public. They use othering language that presupposes that Christians and LGBT people are separate, mutually exclusive groups. So, for Matthew Vines, it's not exclusive. For other people, of course, it is exclusive. So there's a conflict there. Another case of conflict is illustrated by this picture. Who are these folks? Well, one's a Kentuckian. Anybody remember her name? Kim Davis. She was the clerk who would not issue a marriage license. and you had to have a marriage license in order to go get married, and she would not do it. And this is, of course, Mike Huckabee, who was one of two presidential hopefuls. I think there were actually three that rushed there, but only two got there, were admitted to come be photographed with her as a kind of spiritual advisor, and she's just being released on bail. It's not really a victory, but it's presented in that light. So what do we have? We've got more controversy. County clerks saying that they will not issue marriage licenses to same-sex marriages they believe are not natural and thus not of God. Now watch for that word natural, because the mostly Protestant South doesn't have a natural law tradition. That really would get that in the Catholic Church, but because of the abortion, anti-abortion bonds that have been struck over the last 40 years, natural law thinking has come together and is used more widely. So the clerks began to interpose themselves as the last bastion of what was right and natural. Next came southern states using the natural to protect the public, and particularly school children, from transgender youth and adults choosing the bathroom they personally feel comfortable in, arguing instead that transgender persons must use the bathroom according to their gender at birth. Once again, the view of natural law, God's natural law, figures strongly here. And pretty much every state we've been talking about, and I got asked about what about East Texas this morning. Yeah, I mean culturally, all of these states, it isn't just the Confederacy. Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, parts of Ohio are all parts of this, along with Texas, for the same religious reasons. And I like this cartoon because it illustrates, it's all very fine and well to say, use the gender that you were assigned at birth, missing out that some people are intersex at birth, less than 1%, but some people still aren't born with such clear dividing lines. And the youth is given the get yelled at or get beat up alternative, given who the youth actually is. Then we go on to another abiding conflict, and these are all pictures from right nearby. This is Murphysboro, the Murphysboro Islamic Center. First, there was, you see up here the sign that went up that said, "Future sign of Islamic Center of Murphysboro, not welcome." You may or may not know that the Muslims of Murphysboro were by and large the doctors who worked at St. Thomas and at the VA for years, had been there for years. Not a large community, but they'd become more affluent and wanted to move out of the old church that they'd been using, that they'd bought from somebody else, and move out to nicer space. And then there was the act of burning the Caterpillar equipment on the construction site. And finally, the dedication. It eventually came. But it was an example of what happens again and again about the panic of 78 million people, about 50, I've got the 2012 figure, 930 Muslims out of a population of more than 78 million Americans in these southern states, spending enormous amounts of time about what is happening to our culture. How are these people taking over? Transgendered folks, again, much less than half of 1%. So a similar number, possibly, but what they represent in terms of fear is tremendous. Now, then we've got, and I'm going to tell you about, I did not make this slide, but I'll tell you where I got it, and that should be surprising in and of itself. So, who's leading the polls in the Alabama 2020 Senate race? Roy Moore. Roy Moore is leading in the who are you likely to vote for, not just for the primary, but for the general election. Now, some of that may involve the likely voter bias that biases white and thus older based on who picks up their phones, landlines anymore. But he's still ahead. What I found interesting when I looked for any graphic about the Moore-Jones rematchup, which again was driven by churches, a big black get out the vote among church women, especially black church women, for Doug Jones, remembering that he's one of two guys who brought the 16th Street Baptist bombers to justice, and a large number of people who appreciated Moore's position on against gay marriage and for the inclusion of God in Alabama justice. This one stuck out. And why it stuck out is because it came from Patheos. Does anybody know what Patheos is? So it's the Christian web blog. It's pretty slick. It's like the next generation from ours down's evangelical alternative to Christianity today. So all the people who love Rachel Held Evans write on this all the time, and they're using this strong language about Roy Moore. These are Christians talking about Christian pedophile Roy Moore. So it's an intra-Christian debate about this guy, and they're, choosing an unflattering picture, weaponizing the flag, and putting up a dirty kind of thing. So this leads me, and I hope you all, to a kind of, so which is it? Is it hospitality or grit? Is the dominant religious dimension of the South basically charitable and hospitable, or morally judgmental and hostile to difference? Is it all about hating on the Muslims and their Sharia law, or is it all about bringing casseroles to people who've lost a loved one? Well, as you might expect, it's both and more, and sometimes in the same people. which is, of course, what makes it interesting. I picked out some things from the conclusion for this week. The Christianities we've encountered are several, plural, and manifold. And as such, they fund both the instinct to help strangers and to anathematize them. Many of the finest moral acts of Southern Christians and their communities emerge out of the fact that everyone knows in their bones the stories of the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, and the loving father, and the woman who gave her last coin. Southern Christians know what virtue looks like. But the family and what is natural are also powerful symbols that are held dear by most Christians in the South. And these are symbols that are easily manipulated to mean new things in new situations. Therefore, there's no simple claim that Jesus would have us do what is right for our families. You know, a preacher might get up and say, Jesus would have us do what's right for our families. But then you don't know what's going to come next. It would depend on what's right, what's due, what's families. It almost gets into, anybody hear Attorney General Barr yesterday? Mincing words. It was right back into it depends what the definition of is. Well, this is one of those kinds of situations. There's no simple claim like Jesus would have us do what is right for our families that will get total assent in the South among all Christians of all stripes if we mean they will agree on both the sentiment. They will. They like that sentiment. We like that sentiment. And what it means. They won't agree. Indeed, the phrase is almost meaningless tautology until a dialogue begins as to the meaning of the words our. Who's the our? Who are the families? Do they denote all families? Catholic families? Just white families? Black families too? Just black families? Inside like an AME church? What about Hispanic families? What about immigrant families? LGBT families? LGBT folks don't have families, do they? Oh, yes, they do. Then a similar dialogue would have to be undertaken about what doing what is right means. A lot of moral freight in Christian circles and the Southern political circles that overlap with them gets carried on by ambiguous, noble-sounding rhetoric. Sometimes I tune in to the 5 o'clock version of the PBS NewsHour, right? The 5 o'clock version is on NPT2. But if I'm really lucky, I get the Tennessee legislature instead. And at the end of the day, which is when, at 5 o'clock, you often catch somebody grandstanding about the moral values of this, that, or the other thing. Be it the schools. As a rural legislature, I know that the children of Shelby County and Davidson County really need good schooling. So, on and on it goes. Noble-sounding rhetoric. Even harmonious-sounding Christian talk can mask a great deal of actual dissonance. For this reason, understanding the Christianities in their particularity seems more important than ever to me if we're to understand the place of religion in contemporary Southern life. But it's a harder sell over where I work. I'm both in the divinity school where Christians like to understand Christians and Jews and Muslims and vice versa. And I'm over in the history department as a graduate faculty member. And when I was presenting a part of this book at a work-in-progress seminar, a very bright history PhD student posed an incisive question. She asked, the one that's up on the board, what difference does it make that all these people are Christians and talking in Christian terms if they end up on such opposite sides of any of these important political questions? In other words, might we just bracket the religious rhetoric and watch for political terms like liberty, equality, freedom, coercion, and control? That's what she thought. After all, patriotism and refuge, and religion are often fig leaves for their baser motives. You know, you wrap yourself in the flag and attack another country, that kind of thing. In the end, however, my studies out of this book and what we've been talking about convince me that the time spent with Southern Christians across the spectrum suggests that this substitution would be a mistake. For the faith-inflected fears, hopes, memories, and visions of liberation that are recorded in the pages of the book and the 5-6 weeks we've been together are bound together by a common sense of stories taken from the Bible. In the South, you're much more likely to not just go to church where you hear a sermon based upon the Bible, but also go to adult Sunday school. These stories shape and form Southerners in a way that gives a common culture. And there's more. There are experiences found in church and society which fund robust and sometimes bitter argument about how those stories and their lessons are applicable to this place and time. Sometimes we hear elaborate, textured harmonies. This church says the Good Samaritan story means this, and this church says that, and they sort of sound, it's both about the Good Samaritan, but it sounds a little different when they're talking about immigrants and, you know, whether we should help them go back to their own countries or we ought to treat them real well here. So other times, as in this moment of deep division, with all of those conflicts that I showed you, where Southern Christians divide about sexuality issues and personal freedom, we hear nearly a cacophony. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. Yet the thing we miss if we turn this into pure political analysis, if we just say, okay, I'm listening for equality and I'm listening for coercion and I'm listening, is that we miss the primary languages in which 3/4 of the 78 million people understand and express their lives, right? They're churchy people that think in churchy terms even about politics, even about how to raise families, even how to discipline their children. And the disciplining takes different forms. Do you have an Old Testament dad or do you have a Jesus dad? You'll get, you can imagine how that might go out. Discarding the religious terms that diverse Southern Christians use for their lives, values, motives, and aspirations for the way things are shaped and change happens in the largely Christian South would be a mistake. So understanding this stuff is helpful, even if it doesn't always precisely lead, oh, you're Christian, I know how you vote. Doesn't work that way. But you know something interesting about them, and transformation still comes out of this core identity. And this was explained to me early and forcefully in a way that I'd like to salute. This is Charles Blanton Couser. Unfortunately, the only picture I could find was from his obituary. He died a couple years ago, a great New Testament professor down at Columbia Seminary where I worked. And he grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And he talked about how this church he was in, where his father was pastor, was extremely conservative, very racist, but also very Christian. And he said, a bunch of segregationist Christians taught me the Bible, and the Bible taught me that segregation was wrong. So all these Sunday school people who were committed to 1930s and 40s segregation taught him the stories, and the stories shined a mirror on their practices, or held up a mirror on their practices. And Charlie was one of the sort of great progressives in the Presbyterian Church, but never gave up teaching Bible because it had a transformative power. And for me, in this region where we have a tangled racial history and so many different people saying this is what the Bible says and means, it's still interesting that way. The transformation still comes out of holding these, actually the Bible has conflicting accounts. I just said one. Do you get an Old Testament dad who beats you with a belt, or a Jesus dad who sets you down and tells you a story that makes you discipline yourself? And so we return in the end to hospitality and one of those formative stories. In the Epistle to the Hebrews, which harkens back again and again, especially to Abraham, it says, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers." Now this is a Christian community that is under attack, right? Early Christians, Jewish Christians who are being assaulted from without by other Christians and by Romans. And it's saying, nevertheless, given the fact that people hate on you, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. For by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Abraham doesn't always do the right thing, but he is visited by strangers. They turn out to be angels, and his life turns out better. This is taught as a virtue. It's that hospitality of you never know who you might be serving that drives things. So this is a virtue, finally, that's both religious and cultural, this Christian Southern hospitality. How's it net out? If I have a hope, if there is a hope, that these deeply committed and divided millions can transcend their fears and hostilities based in ethnicity, race, sexuality, and religious difference itself. It's that their commitment to hospitality requires that they extend themselves to strangers. That extension beyond self and clan is not perfect, and as in the scriptures Southerners hold dear, hospitality beyond one's own is honored sometimes more in the breach than in fact. The lines of division are strong and reinforced by moralisms and biblicism, but the resources for change, even reconciliation, come from the same sources. And those sources demand that no one remain a stranger for very long. Like rocks in a river, the Christianities of the contemporary South are still being shaped by their environment and by one another. So, history will continue. And this region has absorbed Midwesterners, Westerners, foreigners, the Werner von Braun, folks in Huntsville who bring German restaurants and a good symphony, but also end up going to Methodist and Baptist churches. It's a really interesting region that has the power and continuing power out of its originally biracial, largely Christian identity to continue to shape and be an important force in American civil life. Sometimes for ill, and sometimes for the good. And with that, let me answer some questions. Sure.
I was told something on Tuesday in another class that either I didn't know, I've never heard it spoken, and I was wondering if you had run across it in your research. And it has to do with incarceration.
Yeah.
The statement was made that an incarcerated felon cannot be ordained in any Christian religion in America.
I kind of doubt that.
Okay.
Now, it would probably be hard in many denominations, and the more organized the denomination, the more they would want that person to go through training that would involve being outside the prison walls, right? But the less organized, if you will, off on the Pentecostal wing or another free church wing, somebody could ordain somebody. So, but it's not. I can't imagine there being a law except in the federal system.
No, it was not presented as a law. It
Yeah.
was presented as a Christian practice within structured denominations, and in light of I think that's going to be, I know that our governor is looking at this issue, and that we could see some recommended modifications, I guess is the best way to say it, in how we treat prisoner incarceration, what we do. So it just took me aback that Christians don't forgive prisoners.
Men who'd done some terrible things and were never getting out, but they'd done everything right inside to address things, and how different he was in his approach than some of these religious groups that were there to help the prisoners. So that makes me think of one other way to sort of amplify this whole talk, which is we as Tennesseans have just gone through, we've had two recent Republican governors. Our current governor, Bill Lee, very committed Christian, and our past governor, both of whom displayed certain, if you will, side constraints that they observed imposed upon them by their faith, right? Things that they just were like, I'm not going to do that. That they would have been more popular inside their party had they done. And I think it's not just the gravity of office and being the person who has to decide. It's also it's trying to connect to my iPhone. Thanks very much, iPhone. It's also how this whole the moral formation of a governor happened back in Sunday school and at Mother's Knee and all this other kind of stuff that sometimes gets forgotten. This is Reinhold Niebuhr's point, right? You get in a big legislature, a room full of people, and you start being a little more rough than you would be if it were just yourself and your conscience in the governor's mansion. Yeah, and that's a flip side. This punishment of others that we excel at in our place. Yeah.
You mentioned in an earlier lecture that religiosity in America is declining, in the South.
Yeah.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic that as we're in this, what I would call a transitionary period from what I would call the old line of conservative Christianity to something different, that Christianity will kind of reinvent itself in the next 20 years, or do you think it's going to kind of keep these trends going?
So, optimistic, no. Hopeful, yes. And what's the difference? Optimistic would be like, oh, the demography is such that the Christian churches will fill again with new babies, and baptisms will follow, and everything will be the same again or better. Yeah, I don't see those kinds of changes. We are becoming more secular country in so many ways, and as the South becomes less rural and more urban, it will accelerate that process. The hopeful side is that there are a lot of points, if you look at the long history of the Christian movement, or the Muslims, for that matter, or the Jews, where you said, these folks are finished. And they've always found a way, because of the importance of the religion to their understanding of the meaning of life, that they've regenerated new ways of being. Now, that's not great news if you're trying to prop up a dying church, a dying congregation. That may be hard. It may be easier to start a congregation than to keep the doors open on an aging plant in a suburban ring neighborhood where the houses have all gone to rentals or something like that. Yeah.
I find it interesting that your class has paralleled Victor Judge's tomorrow on Light in August. Christianity as it's seen in Light in August by William Faulkner. And writing in 1932, I think it is, he brings out, the author brings out some of the same issues that you have addressed throughout this 6 weeks. It's really been a parallel.
Yeah, so the point is made about the parallels with Light in August, written in 1932, and the themes of this course. I love Southern Gothic fiction, so that's probably, and did even before I moved south, because it reminded me of my extended family in the South. I had my grandmother's, this is a little too personal, but my grandmother's brother didn't like his own son, but he liked his daughter-in-law married to that son, and when they got divorced, or maybe because they got divorced or something like that, he marries marries his son's ex-wife. And I'm going, so yeah, And so the understanding of how life, morality, how religion stands as both to make us straight and be a shield for our bentness is very interesting to me. Sure.
I have no question about the power of the symbols, like hospitality, etc., that you're talking about. However, with the decline of the main line, there is less critical interpretation of those symbols, whereas the increase of private schools, homeschooling, and the continued vitality of education in conservative, then the question is, how powerful are those symbols to continue when in fact they're being promulgated in one way and decreasing in the other?
Yeah, I think that's worth worrying about, and our great weakness relative to other parts of the country, like Colorado, for example, which has many of the same, booming economy, big central city, and decent rural areas all around, but they've got great education statewide. What is it that caused us? We never had great education, but we've never moved into it. And that's not just Tennessee, that's state after state, southern state after southern state. And so, that's one thing. You talk about the decline of the caretaking institutions. Here you'd have to say the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Methodists, sometimes the Church of Christ, certainly the Southern Baptist Convention before it flipped to fundamentalist in '79 and onwards. Now, not all Southern Baptist churches truly flipped. They just, the convention got flipped, but it meant that the national discourse that got taking place, they weren't a part of it in D.C. the way they had been part of it, or informing their congregations the way the old Baptist Sunday School Board did. So, that central caretaking role has been farmed out, just like the schools are farmed out. And you say, well, if it's a sort of a thin, farmed out, you got trees with lots of branches but not much trunk, what kind of society do you have? We shall see. Okay. Anything else? Well, if not, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it. You've been a great class.